Let's have a discussion on this work. Follow the lesson video for free and pick up all the tips from the video, but if you're interested, I do have a sheet music edition of this work, and there's a link for that in the description. Today's lesson is going to be more just about context about playing the piece, so things to keep in mind, as well as discussing the arranging process from the original Baroque tablature to my sheet music edition, and I'll explain some of the choices I made, as well as the ornamentation in the work. I really love these partitas. They are playable by the intermediate student. However, the opportunity to make them very advanced becomes very obvious once you start raising the tempo and adding ornamentation. These works can be quite advanced. However, they're quite playable by the intermediate student as well. I really love that. It means the piece isn't too taxing, but the opportunity is there for advanced playing. The texture of the piece is definitely a little bit thinner and lighter than, for example, Weiss or Bach. That's one of the reasons it allows for some of these changes, but also it allows for example, in that first movement, for a tempo and a style of performance that you don't usually get from other composers. It's more reminiscent of chamber music of the era, the energy of it. So that thinner texture, again, offers lots of opportunity. One of the great things about this piece is that we're transferring the music from a 6-string instrument to the guitar, which is also 6 strings in the same relative tuning, which means that we're playing authentic Baroque music without a lot of compromise from the original. When you play something like Bach, which is kind of more keyboard music, definitely lute music, or a more comparable composer would be Sylvius Weiss. In Weiss, though, we're transferring the music from like a 13-chorus Baroque lute, and we're making tons of compromises and changes all the time to it. And so it ends up being complex, both in the arranging process and performance as well. A lot of them kind of just don't work on the classical guitar. Whereas here, we're transferring it with very little effort. I can read and play these from the original Baroque tablature, making them authentic and manageable, and offers us a lot of opportunity to impart musical character and Baroque performance practice in a piece that we can actually manage. And therefore, I think that my edition and my performance there is very accurate to the original tablature, with the exception of the first movement, which I will be discussing. The use of slurs in the first movement is a discussion we'll have shortly. First thing I want to cover is just the ornamentation. The original Baroque tablature uses some unique, well, not too unique, I mean, but unique to the Baroque tablature era. But he's using commas on either side of the tablature to indicate an ornament that occurs on the upper auxiliary or the lower auxiliary. I have changed these into a short trill symbol for any ornament starting on the upper auxiliary. So for example, if your primary note is G, the upper auxiliary might be A. So you might do like a trill, or you might do an appoggiatura to the written note. So you would start on the upper auxiliary. I've used a lower prefix on that to indicate ornaments that start on a lower auxiliary. So for example, if the primary note is G, maybe you're doing an appoggiatura from F to G. So you would start your ornament on the lower auxiliary. He also uses, a couple of times he uses specifically the trill symbol, so I've indicated that with a TR in the score. But the thing to remember about all this ornamentation is that ornamentation is very flexible. You don't have to follow it. And actually, I recommend that you start practicing the piece without the ornaments. Learn the primary notes. The music's beautiful with just the primary notes. And then once you know that and you're solid with the primary notes, you can add ornamentation to it in a natural way, because you're ornamenting the actual primary notes. So practice without ornamentation and then add it afterwards if you want. Advanced players will definitely want to, but as an intermediate student, those ornaments might make it that much more difficult, so you can leave them out. And also, like, ornamentation is flexible, right? So even though it says like start on an upper auxiliary, the primary note is G, it says start on the upper auxiliary. You don't have to do that if you don't think it's appropriate to the piece. I follow it fairly accurately, but there's a couple that I change because I didn't think it worked musically. Most of the time, what he indicates is actually very appropriate because the upper auxiliary is like a suspension over the bar. So like there's a note previous to that that's an A, and then the ornament goes from A to G, making a cool non-chord tone leading to a resolution. You don't have to know any of this technical talk, but nevertheless, I think the ornaments are most of the time are appropriate. But on occasion, you can change them. And also, it's very interchangeable sometimes. You don't have to do an appoggiatura. You can do a trill instead. Sometimes when it says a lower auxiliary, instead of playing like an appoggiatura from the lower note, I'll play a mordent, or something like that. So it's very flexible. And that's why I used these symbols, is to offer a flexibility to the score, but to still indicate what was in the original tablature. The next thing I want to discuss are the slurs in the piece. In guitar lingo, that's hammer-ons and pull-offs. The original tablature does have slurs, and I've included those in the score, with the exception of the first movement. So, follow the slurs, or you can change them or add more. Again, this kind of articulation is flexible. Slurs facilitate legato, so if you feel like adding more, by all means. I pretty much follow what he indicates. But in the first movement, he does something very strange, is that during the arpeggio section, the various arpeggio sections in the piece, if he wants to stay in position, so he'll mix normal arpeggios like this with slur figures. That is exceedingly difficult to do at fast tempos. It's possible at slower tempos, but at fast tempos, it's really difficult to do. And also, it changes the musical texture for no compositional reason. For that reason, I've actually changed those sections, and I've marked this in the preface of the sheet music, but I've changed those sections to be arpeggio. So instead of doing like slurs sometimes, or I will do all cross-strung. And especially in, the section around measure 18. He actually changes it sometimes just randomly. To include that G sharp there. So it's a little bit lax in the consistency of the texture. And it's also just exceedingly difficult to play those evenly at fast tempo. So if you want a really quick tempo, I have removed the slurs. I've marked that in the preface, what sections I do it in. But just so you're aware, I think it's really unrealistic and there's no compositional reason to mix the texture in that way. So I have changed that one aspect of just those couple of sections in the first movement, which are really just that measure 13, that measure 18 section, and then just a little section at the very end I changed as well from 3-note slurs to 2-note slurs. So just in the first movement, and the rest I've kept all the same. The first movement has such a intense energy that those slurs just really don't work. I would love to see someone play it at fast tempos with them, but I consider them to not work. Okay, so I'll just say a brief word about each movement, but we're not going to do a walkthrough in this particular case. So the first movement is just full of like a chamber music energy that you just never see in guitar music. And it's the reason I chose this partita, is that energy in the first movement, that kind of like, it's so infectious and it's so amazing. And I can't think of another piece that does it quite in this way. Along with that, though, comes a much thinner texture in order to get that energy and that tempo going. So if you played it slowly, it can still be excellent, but certainly pouring energy into it in terms of tempo and excitement makes the piece really special and unique. Also makes it more difficult, of course. I like to impart that energy partly through the tempo, like lots of growth through each measure and directional phrasing, like really pushing you forward at all times, but also with a little bit of articulation. Like you can hear I'm detaching some of those notes, except for the beat there, but short, 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 long, short, 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 long, short. Some articulation like that can really help. As you go through other areas of the piece, sometimes the bass becomes more prominent, like in the arpeggios. So there's lots of little things you can do along the way to add push and pull. So in those arpeggio sections, I think like throwing the bass in there for directional phrasing is really important. Later on in that particular movement, highlighting, those upper notes that are in the top voice. I think that's really important. And then, of course, later in the movement, it gets a little bit thicker and more chromatic. So the excitement happens just because it's going to make you do a real workout at the end there if your tempo is high. The first minuet, I don't have too much to say. It's a brilliant minuet, kind of a highlight of the whole partita, with the 3 different sections in it and quite unique sections at that. I think the main thing here is that you want to reserve your tempo slightly for the Bouree. There's no slow movement or like saraband or anything in the piece, so reserve some of your tempo so that you have it for the Bouree. And so just take a very stately and like rhythmic approach to this. Lots of emphasis on the first beat and kind of a stately feel to it. And that will give it lots of character and vitality, even if you lower the tempo slightly. I also just like to play the trio much more legato, just for contrast. So the Menuet I just being really kind of stately and more articulated, and then the trio just much more legato and flowing and sustained, just for contrast. The Bouree, very exciting, not difficult if you don't have the ornaments, but once you add the ornamentation in, makes it a little bit more challenging, that's for sure, especially if you raise the tempo. But very almost Bach-ian kind of Bouree here. Really fun to play. I would put quite a bit of rhythmic energy into it and raise your tempo a little bit for that one. The Menuet II, you're back to using a more reserved tempo. I think that's smart too, because the Gigue that follows it is a little bit challenging to play at fast speeds. So you want to make sure your Menuet II is slow enough to make it feel like the Gigue that comes after it is an exciting tempo that is the finale of the piece. So in that Menuet II, just, reserved, stately, articulated, so it has lots of character, but reserve some of your energy for the Gigue. In the Gigue, pretty straightforward, a very, very light texture, almost primarily just those upper voices. Sometimes it switches to the lower voice, but it's really focused on just one voice at a time, despite there being two voices present at all times. But a lot of the bass notes are open strings or manageable for the most part. A big slur workout, of course, in this movement. There's just one or two spots where I did ditch the bass note. Like in measure 9 there, I leave out that A and the bass in the last beat. It's just a little bit of a handful at faster tempos to do that. You can practice it. It depends on what tempo you take. That's just, I left out one note in the bass because it was just a little unmanageable. Nevertheless, it's just that it's a movement that seems really simple at first, but then once you start picking up the tempo, it's like lots of navigation over the guitar, lots of slurs, lots of opportunity for squeaks, buzzes, and error, just general error because the notes fly by so fast. So you need to take your time with that. And other than that, though, it's really follow that upper voice, and then in those certain sections, just you follow the bass line. It's very clear in the music, though. So a wonderful partita, and this is the second partita that I've arranged, and the first one I did was number 16. This is number 15. So I'm really loving these. I think they're underplayed. I think that guitar players should be playing this way more because they're quite manageable, but you can do so much with them and bring them to such high levels. And then you're playing authentic Baroque music, but you're not struggling with like a Bach lute suite, which is, for most people, is quite overwhelming. It's hard to bring out lots of the good music because you're just struggling so much to keep a handle on the counterpoint and the thick texture. Here we have something much more manageable, but unlike Weiss, when you arrange Weiss, he's using a lute with so many strings. Here we're transferring over from an instrument with 6 strings in the same tuning, much more appropriate, much more manageable, and just, again, offers you that opportunity to take it to high levels if you want, but also feasible for intermediate students. So they're just awesome pieces, and I really like the authentic Baroque feel in all of them.